Let me illustrate that point in this way. You remember this graphic depicting the benevolent Globo mess. Since the 1950s, we have been building a global arms control and non-proliferation regime. That has been useful not just for the purpose of avoiding nuclear war, which is no small thing in itself, but also for the purpose of making sure that we have an effective climate regime. Since without an effective non-proliferation regime, we can't be sure that civilian nuclear power will be safe and indeed confined to peaceful uses. And now we can see the urgent need for a global financial regime as well, in order to provide transparency and basic standards and best practices in the way that money moves around the world. Putting that regime in place should be seen not as a competing priority with the other two, but as a reinforcing one, certainly with regard to climate change. Why? Because restoring the stability of the world's credit markets is essential if we're going to encourage and finance new, commercially viable technologies to end our dependence on fossil fuels, and if we're going to have efficient, equitable markets in which to trade in carbon allotments. So what we've got here is the ultimate challenge of our ability to do multitasking of a kind beyond anything we have ever contemplated, much less accomplished. Let me now, as I wind up, put that challenge into, and particularly with regard to climate change, into the context of all that history that we have galloped through in the last 20 minutes. Basically, we need a major, indeed unprecedented breakthrough in the laboratory of the global experiment. Now, we've had significant breakthroughs before, but over the millennia, they have almost always followed breakdowns. In other words, it's a pretty dangerous laboratory, this thing called history, and this thing called the Great Experiment, and very often discoveries were preceded by explosions. Bad news has been the mother of good news. Look at those examples that we touched on earlier. It took the 30 Years' War to bring about the Treaty of Westphalia. It took the Napoleonic Wars to set the scene for the Concert of Europe. We had to suffer through World War I before there could be even the false start of the League of Nations. And we had to go through World War II before we had more success with the United Nations. So what do all those cases have in common? They have this: progress, such as it has been reactive. Whereas in dealing with climate change, we need to be proactive. And history gives us only one consoling precedent that we may be up to that challenge. The danger of World War III was enough to inspire Jack Kennedy and his successors to sign treaties that kept the Cold War from turning hot. We didn't have to experience Armageddon to head it off. The looming menace was enough. And let's hope that same will be true with respect to a global climate catastrophe, both in getting us to face up to the magnitude of the danger before it's too late, and even harder, getting us to take the steps for a proactive climate control regime. As we all know by now, responsibility is one of President Obama's favorite words. When he first sat down behind this desk 86 days ago, he assumed what could turn out to be the number one most difficult responsibility of all time. If President Obama serves 2 terms in office, his presidency may well coincide with what could be our last chance to turn the corner on climate change. And that would make him uniquely responsible for generations to come. And for that matter, a generation that is already born. Now, everyone here this afternoon, no matter what age, has some reason to identify with this generation, and therefore to take the future not just seriously, but personally. President Obama certainly has good reason to do that, since he has 2 representatives of that generation right there in the White House with him. And by the way, since this is my PowerPoint, I've gotten to include my granddaughter Lola, who is very much on my mind in this context. The point is, all of us can imagine faces from our own families on this screen. And we must keep those faces in mind when we go back to the slides that we were looking at a moment ago. Those of us who are middle-aged or older will probably get through our lives without reaping the consequences of human-induced climate change. But when the roughly 2 billion children we share the planet with today get to the year 2060, and they're, say, in their 50s, do we want their world to be here at the point on this curve where the global climate warming phenomenon becomes irreversible and much of the planet becomes inhospitable to humanity? Or do we want it to be here with the planet on this trajectory with some chance of being livable? Now, the answer to that question is obvious, pretty obvious. But achieving the goal is anything but easy. And it will depend to a large extent more on choices that we make now than on choices that that generation of young people we saw will have the luxury to make decades from now. So for that reason alone, we Americans must live up to the ideal that this fellow gave his life for. For if we fail to recognize our own responsibility as citizens of the world, we risk, if not our own lives, then those of our children and their children. And I'd like to imagine that that's the point Socrates is making in this picture. It's definitely the one that I'm ending on. Thank you very much.
We have some lights back on?
Yeah, I think the top button.
Yep.
If only so I can see you.
Great.
Very good.
Well, thank you very much, Strobe, for a very thought-provoking presentation. And I know there's a number of people who have already read your book who have some specific questions and thoughts they'd like to share. I would ask for the Q&A, we have about 20 to 25 minutes. If you can please just identify yourself and please keep your questions crisp and short, if you would. With that.
Mm-hmm.
Goodness.
Yes, please.
Strobe, Rita Hauser here. You ended on the urgency of global warming and the need to do something about it, and then you interfaced with the economic crisis. Well, it seems, unfortunately, that the ideas of Obama for cap and trade and so on, from what I hear in Washington, are already dead, simply because the costs are such that it would be translated as an energy tax for most people. It would cost more for electricity and gas and so on. People would not be willing to pay. From what I'm gathering in Washington, it will not be pushed forward in the near future. So how do you pay for all the things you have to do to end global warming in the way you described, given the economic crisis we're in?
Rita, I either am a better or a worse source on that since I just came from Washington. That probably makes me a worse source. But in any event, I have been talking a lot, including in recent days and indeed in recent weeks and even in one case in recent hours, with people who are involved on both sides of this, by which I mean both in the executive and legislative branch. I think it is premature to say that any of these aspirations is dead. And particularly this one. Now, where I think where our information may coincide is that it is probably unrealistic to think that the administration working with the Congress will succeed in getting a meaningful climate change bill through the Congress before the Copenhagen meeting this fall.